Some stories stay with you because they remind you of something true. This is one of those. It's about a young woman in 1883 Montana who stood at an altar with trembling hands, married off to save her family's failing farm. She believed she had been sold. Most folks would. But what she found in that quiet ranch house, and in the man who never once demanded anything of her, changed everything she thought she knew about love, about freedom, and about the courage it takes to stay when leaving would be easier. I hope you'll find something familiar here, something that settles warm in your chest like coffee on a cold morning. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Hannah Whitaker pressed her palms against the rough calico of her borrowed dress, but the tremor crawled up her wrists anyway. The preacher's voice droned above her words about duty, covenant, God's blessing, but all she heard was the creak of floorboards and the whisper of women behind her. "I do," the man beside her said. She hadn't looked at him. Not once. 35 years old. They'd told her. Owns the biggest ranch this side of the Yellowstone. Needs a wife. Needs a wife the way a man needs a plow horse. Miss Whitaker. The preacher waited. The whole church waited. Hannah opened her mouth. The words came dry. "I do." Her father stood near the back pew. She felt his eyes, but wouldn't turn. 3 seasons of drought had put her here. 3 seasons. And a debt her family couldn't pay. The iron band slid onto her finger, cold, too tight, done. If this opening stirred something in your heart, I'd love to know where you're joining us from today. They say good stories travel far, and the best ones find their way home. Drop a comment below and let's sit a spell together. The wagon ride took 20 miles of silence. Hannah kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the road ahead, on the backs of the horses, on anything but the man beside her. Daniel Brooks held the reins loose, said nothing. The wind cut through her thin shawl, and she didn't ask for a blanket. The house appeared against a sky the color of old tin, bigger than she'd expected. 2 stories. Dark windows. A porch that wrapped around the front like arms waiting to close. "There's food inside," Daniel said. His voice was low, rough from disuse. "I'll see to the horses." He didn't help her down from the wagon. She climbed down herself, boots hitting the hard-packed dirt, and walked toward the house alone, inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else a soap. Maybe. Lie. The kitchen was clean. The parlor was clean. Everything scrubbed and orderly and utterly empty of warmth. She found the bedroom at the end of the hall, a cast-iron bed frame painted white, the paint chipped at the corners, a hand-stitched quilt faded to pale blue, a dresser with nothing on top, empty hooks on the wall where pictures used to hang. A woman had lived here once. The absence screamed louder than any presence could. Hannah shut the door. Her fingers found the brass lock green with age, cold under her palm. She slid it home. Click. The only sound she controlled in this house. She pressed her back against the door and listened. The house creaked, wind pushed against the windows. Somewhere outside, a horse nickered. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming down the hall. Hannah's breath caught. Her hands flattened against the wood behind her. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Silence. She waited for the knock, for the demand. For whatever came next, nothing came. The footsteps moved on, faded down the hall. A door opened and closed somewhere else in the house. Hannah stood there for a long time, her heart thudding against her ribs, her palms slick against the wood. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the moon cross the glass, waiting for something that never happened. When dawn came gray through the curtains, she opened the door 2 inches. A tin plate sat on the floor. Blue enamel rim, sourdough bread, dried apple slices, still warm. The first 2 weeks blurred into routine. Daniel left before light. The creak of the front door, the thud of boots on the porch, the jingle of harness from the barn. Hannah learned to track his movements by sound alone. She'd lie in bed, listening, until the hoofbeats faded toward the far pastures. Only then would she rise. The kitchen became her territory. She learned where the cast iron skillets hung, seasoned black from years of use. She learned the pump sink's stubborn handle, the way it groaned before the water came. She found the root cellar beneath the back porch potato bins half full, onions hanging from the rafters, the smell of damp earth and last season's harvest. She learned the stove. That took longer. The first time she tried to cook beans, she burned them. The smell filled the kitchen, acrid, shameful. She scraped the charred mess into the slop bucket, her face hot, her hands shaking. When Daniel came in at dusk, she set the ruined pot on the table and waited for the anger. He sat down, picked up his fork, ate. Every bite, every blackened, bitter bite. He scraped the pot clean and set it aside without a word. Hannah stared at him. He didn't look up. "Storm coming," he said. "Best bring the chickens in tonight." That was all. Days passed. They moved around each other like 2 strangers sharing a stagecoach, careful, deliberate, never touching. Meals happened in silence. She looked at the table, the wall, the window. Anywhere but his face. He spoke in small words. "Eggs in the coop. Coffee's on. Rain by morning." She answered in smaller ones. "Yes, thank you. I will." One afternoon, she found a sewing kit in the bottom drawer of the parlor bureau. Needles, thread in 6 colors, a thimble worn thin at the tip. She pulled it out and examined the contents. Good quality, barely used. She mended her own dress first, the hem that had torn on the wagon ride, the seam splitting under the arm. Then she noticed the shirt draped over the chair by the door. Daniel's work shirt, a rip along the shoulder seam, the fabric frayed from catching on something. Her hands moved before her mind could stop them. Thread through needle, needle through cloth, small, even stitches, the way her mother had taught her. When Daniel came in that evening, the shirt was folded on the chair. He picked it up, looked at the mended seam, said nothing, but the next morning, he wore it. The kitchen window became her watching post. She'd stand at the sink, hands in wash water, and her eyes would drift to the barn, the paddock, the fields beyond. One morning, she saw him working with a young mare, a skittish thing, barely 2 years old, all nerves and white-rimmed eyes. Daniel didn't chase, didn't grab. He stood in the center of the paddock with his hands loose at his sides. Talking. She couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she watched his mouth move. Slow, patient. The mare's ears twitched forward. then back, forward again. He took one step, waited, another step. The mare snorted but didn't bolt. 10 minutes passed, 15. Hannah's hands pruned in the water, and still she didn't move. When Daniel finally touched the mare's neck, the animal leaned into his palm. Hannah pulled her hands from the basin, dried them on her apron. Her chest felt tight. That evening, she went looking for salt. The cupboard beside the stove held spices, dried herbs, a tin of baking soda. She reached toward the back, fingers searching. They closed around something wooden. She pulled it out. A horse. Hand-carved maple, small enough to fit in a child's palm. One ear chipped, dust thick on the mane. The air left her lungs. She turned the toy over. The carving was careful. Detailed hours of work in every line. The kind of thing a father would make for a son. She looked at the empty hooks on the parlor wall, the closed door at the end of the hall, the bedroom with the faded quilt, and the woman's absence screaming from every corner. A child. There had been a child. Hannah shoved the horse back into the cupboard and closed the door fast. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night at dinner, she asked her first real question. "Where do you keep the flour?" Daniel looked up from his plate. His eyes met hers just for a moment, just long enough. "Pantry," he said. "Second shelf, behind the salt." She nodded, looked back at her food. The silence stretched between them. But it was different now, heavier, full of things neither of them had said. After dinner, she washed the dishes alone. The window framed the night sky, stars thick as scattered salt, the dark line of mountains against the horizon. She thought about the wooden horse, the empty hooks, the closed door. Daniel had lost more than a wife. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. The question sat in her chest, pressing against her lungs. What else was hiding in this house? What else had he buried behind closed doors and silence? She dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. The hallway stretched dark behind her. The door at the end waited, shut tight. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she'd find something else to do. Tomorrow she'd stop thinking about it. But her eyes kept drifting back to that door. Hannah smoothed her dress 3 times on the wagon ride into town. The calico was clean, she'd scrubbed it the night before. Hung it by the stove to dry, but the fabric was thin. The hem mended twice. The color faded from what had once been a decent blue to something closer to dishwater. She smoothed it again. The wrinkles stayed. Daniel held the reins loose. Eyes on the road, if he noticed her fussing. He didn't say. The town appeared after an hour's ride, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled along a single dirt street. A church steeple at one end, a livery stable at the other. Between them, the general store, the blacksmith. A saloon with its doors propped open despite the November chill. Daniel pulled the wagon to the hitching post outside the general store. The draft horse, a bay mare he called Belle, stamped and blew steam into the cold air. Hannah climbed down before he could offer help. Her boots hit the boardwalk, the planks gray and splintered from weather. She smoothed her dress one more time. Women passed on the sidewalk. 2 of them. Bonnets tied tight, wool shawls wrapped against the wind. They glanced at Hannah. One leaned toward the other, whispered something behind a gloved hand. Neither nodded hello. Hannah kept her chin up, kept walking. The back of her neck burned. The general store smelled of tobacco and pickle brine and something else. Coffee beans, maybe. Or the sharp bite of lye soap stacked near the door. Barrels lined the walls. Fabric bolts crowded the shelves near the window. A glass case held pocket knives and sewing needles and small bottles of patent medicine. A man stood near the counter. Leather vest, suspenders, a week's worth of stubble on his jaw. He looked up when Hannah entered, looked her over slow, deliberate, top to bottom. She turned away, pretended to examine a bolt of calico. Daniel came through the door behind her. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He moved to the counter, pulled a list from his pocket, handed it to the storekeeper. "Flour," he said. "Coffee, salt, 20 pounds of oats." The storekeeper, a thin man with spectacles and a stained apron, nodded and disappeared into the back. Hannah kept her eyes on the fabric. The weave blurred in front of her. She could feel the man in the leather vest watching, could feel other eyes, too. The woman behind the display of ribbon, the old man by the pickle barrels. Everyone knew. Of course they knew. News traveled fast in small towns. A girl married off to pay a debt. A rancher who needed a wife. "Well now," the voice came from behind her, loud, meant to carry. "This must be the new Mrs. Brooks." Hannah turned. The man in the leather vest had moved closer, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders. His mouth stretched in a grin that showed tobacco-stained teeth. "Heard about you," he said. "Whole town's been talking." Hannah's throat tightened. She didn't answer. "Whitaker's girl. Ain't you the one from that dirt farm out past the ridge?" His grin widened. "Heard your daddy owed money all over the county. Heard Brooks here paid it off in one go." The room had gone quiet. Hannah could feel every eye in the store fixed on her. The heat climbed her neck, her cheeks, her ears. "Must be nice," the man said. He rocked back on his heels. "Going from a failing farm to the biggest ranch in the territory, all you had to do was let yourself get bought her cheap, didn't you, Brooks?" The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Daniel had been facing the counter. Now he turned. Slow, his whole body pivoting toward the man in the leather vest. He didn't speak. Didn't move forward. Just stood there, shoulders square, hands loose at his sides, eyes fixed on the man's face. The grin faltered. Daniel took one step. The floorboards groaned. "Walk out." His voice came low. Flat. Quiet as the click of a hammer being drawn back. "Now." The man's jaw worked. His hands dropped from his suspenders. "I was just... now." Silence. The whole store held its breath. The man looked at Daniel's face. Whatever he saw there made him step back. His boots scraped against the floor. He moved toward the door, shoulders hunched, eyes down. The door banged shut behind him. Daniel turned back to the counter. His expression hadn't changed. 20 pounds of oats," he said to the storekeeper, "and add a tin of molasses." The storekeeper nodded, hands trembling slightly as he wrote the order. No one else in the store spoke. No one looked at Hannah directly. Daniel paid in cash, loaded the supplies into the wagon himself. Hannah followed him out, her legs unsteady, her hands pressed flat against her skirt to hide the shaking. The ride home took an hour. The same road, the same brown hills, the same gray sky threatening snow. Daniel held the reins loose, said nothing. Hannah stared at the passing landscape. The man's words echoed in her skull. Bought her cheap, bought her cheap, bought her cheap. But that wasn't what made her hands tremble. Insult. To let it pass. Proving she wasn't worth defending. Or she'd expected him to fight fists swinging, proving he owned her the way a man owns a horse. He'd done neither. He'd stood between her and cruelty, quiet, immovable. And then he'd gone back to buying flour and coffee like nothing had happened. No shouting, no violence, no claiming ownership. Just 3 words, "Walk out, now!" And the man had walked. Hannah's fingers found the edge of her shawl, twisted the fabric, released it. Her chest felt strange, tight, and loose at the same time, like something had shifted inside her ribs. The ranch house appeared over the final ridge. Smoke curled from the kitchen chimney. The horses in the paddock lifted their heads as the wagon approached. Daniel pulled Belle to a stop by the porch. He climbed down, began unhitching the harness. Hannah sat in the wagon for a moment longer, watching him work. The question formed in her mind before she could stop it. What kind of man does that? What kind of man stands up for someone without making them feel owned? She didn't have an answer, but for the first time since the wedding, she wanted to find one. She started watching him without meaning to. It happened slow, the way frost creeps across a window before you notice the glass has gone white. Hannah stood at the kitchen sink, hands in the basin of cold wash water, and her eyes drifted to the barn. Daniel had the young mare in the paddock again, the skittish one, barely 2 years old, still all nerves and wild eyes. He didn't chase, didn't grab for the halter rope. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, talking. Hannah couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she watched his mouth move. Slow, patient. The mare's ears twitched forward, then back, then forward again. Daniel took 1 step, waited, took another. The mare snorted, pawed the ground, didn't bolt. 10 minutes, 15. Hannah's hands pruned in the water, gone numb from the cold, and still she didn't move. She watched him wait, watched him give the animal space, watched him stand there like he had all the time in the world. When Daniel finally touched the mare's neck, the animal leaned into his palm like she'd been waiting for it all along. Hannah pulled her hands from the basin, dried them on her apron. Her chest felt tight in a way she couldn't name. She'd been here almost 3 weeks now. 3 weeks of locked doors and uneasy sleep and waiting for the other boot to drop. 3 weeks of bracing herself for demands that never came. He never entered her room. She noticed that first. The door stayed shut, unless she opened it. Her things, few as they were, remained exactly where she left them. No rummaging, no inspection, no claiming. He never asked where she went when she walked the property lines alone, never questioned what she did with her hours, never looked at her like a man counting his possessions. The pattern built itself without words. Mornings. She started leaving coffee on the stove for him. The first time, she didn't say anything, just left the pot on the heat with a clean tin cup beside it. When she came down later, the cup was washed and drying on the rack. The pot was empty. That evening, a stack of split firewood appeared beside the kitchen door. Enough for 3 days. He didn't mention it either. Coffee for firewood. Mended shirts for oiled hinges. A rhythm without words, without demands, without the weight of expectation. But words came eventually. It happened over dinner, roast chicken she'd cooked herself. The first meal she'd made that didn't taste like ash or char. The skin had crisped up golden. The meat fell off the bone. She set the plate in front of him and held her breath. Daniel took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "Good," he said. One word. It shouldn't have landed so heavy. But Hannah felt her shoulders drop, tension bleeding out through her spine. "Thank you," she said. The kerosene lamp flickered between them, throwing shadows across the pine table. Outside. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. November was settling in hard. "How long you been out here?" The question left her mouth before she could catch it. Daniel looked up from his plate. His eyes met hers. She waited for the demand. The question, the suspicion, it didn't come. 12 years, he said. Come out from Missouri after the war. The war? She did the arithmetic. He would have been young, 23, maybe. You fight, some. His jaw tightened, then released. Wasn't much left back home after. Figured I'd start over. And you came here, and I came here? Hannah pushed a piece of potato around her plate. The questions she really wanted to ask sat heavy on her tongue. The nursery. The wooden horse. The ghosts that lived in every corner of this house. But the words wouldn't come, not yet. You like it? She asked instead. Montana. Daniel set down his fork. Thought on it. Really thought she could see him turning the question over like a man examining a stone in his palm. I don't know nothing else no more, he said finally. Been here so long. I can't remember what Missouri felt like. Can't remember what it smelled like in spring or how the church bells sounded on Sunday. He picked up his fork again. Reckon that means I belong here now, whether I like it or not. The wind rattled the shutters again. Hannah reached for the salt cellar carved pine, worn smooth by years of hands, and her fingers brushed his as he reached for the same. Neither pulled away. Half a breath. The calluses on his palm rasped against her knuckles. His skin was warm. Warmer than she'd expected. Then Hannah reached for her fork, and the moment closed. They finished eating in silence. But it was a different silence than before. Thicker, fuller. Like the air before a summer storm when the pressure drops and everything waits. After dinner, Daniel went out to check the horses. Hannah washed the dishes alone, the hot water stinging her hands. Her mind kept circling back to that half-second of contact. The warmth of his skin, the roughness of his palm. She'd been here 3 weeks. 3 weeks of bracing for the moment he'd show her what he really wanted. But the moment never came. The demands never came. A man who wanted to own would demand, would take. This one only waited. She dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. Through the window, she could see the barn light burning. Daniel's silhouette moved past the door, checking on the skittish mare one more time before bed. Tomorrow she'd leave coffee on the stove again. Tomorrow he'd stack more firewood by the door. Tomorrow they'd orbit each other in this careful dance, never quite touching, never quite speaking the words that hung between them. Hannah turned from the window. Her eye caught the hallway, the dark corridor leading to the back of the house. The door at the end, the one she'd never opened. She'd walked past it a dozen times. Always kept her eyes forward. Always told herself it was none of her business. The wooden horse in the cupboard, the empty hooks on the walls, the questions piling up behind her teeth. But tonight, her feet carried her down the hall without permission. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight. The lamplight from the kitchen didn't reach this far. She moved through shadow. One hand trailing along the wall. The door stood at the end. Plain pine. No lock on the outside. Hannah's hand found the knob, cold iron against her palm. She shouldn't. She wasn't supposed to, but she was already turning it. The door swung inward without a sound. The hinges had been oiled recently, she noticed that first. Someone still cared for this room, even if no one entered it. Moonlight fell through a single window, casting a pale rectangle across the floor. Dust motes hung suspended in the stillness, caught in the silver light like tiny stars frozen mid-fall. The air tasted stale, old. Like a room that had been holding its breath for years, Hannah stood just past the threshold, her hand still on the doorframe. Nothing had disturbed this space in a long time. She could see it in the fine gray layer coating every surface the windowsill, the dresser top, the curved rail of the cradle. The cradle. She moved toward it without deciding to. Her feet found their way across the worn floorboards, each step raising tiny clouds that swirled and settled behind her. The cradle was maple, she could tell by the grain, the honey-colored wood visible beneath the dust. Hand-turned spindles, each one slightly different from the next. Hours of work. Days. Maybe. The kind of care a man put into something he loved. Above it, a mobile hung motionless. Carved wooden stars, unpainted pine, strung on faded ribbon. If she reached up and touched it, the stars would spin. But she didn't touch it. The stillness felt sacred, untouchable, like disturbing it would break something that couldn't be mended. A white crocheted blanket lay folded at the foot of the cradle. The yarn had yellowed with age, gone the color of old cream. Hannah's fingers hovered over it, but didn't make contact. Someone had counted those stitches, worked those hours, expected a baby to sleep beneath it. The smell of camphor drifted up from somewhere. Cedar, maybe. She turned and saw the chest beneath the window. Its lid closed tight. Embroidered linens peeked out from the crack where the lid didn't quite meet the base. Someone had packed away a life in there, folded it up and shut it in the dark. The rocking chair sat in the corner, angled toward the window where morning light would fall. A woman's shawl draped over the seat green wool. Good quality. The kind that would have cost real money. Hannah lifted it before she could stop herself. Soft. Heavier than expected. She brought it to her face without thinking. And there it was, the ghost of lavender. Barely there. Almost gone. But present enough to make her throat close. She put the shawl back exactly as she'd found it. Her hands trembled. On the dresser, the photograph waited. Hannah crossed to it. The silver frame caught the moonlight, throwing small sparks across the wall. She picked it up, tilting it toward the window to see better. A man, a woman, a baby. The man was Daniel, younger 5 years, maybe more. The lines around his eyes weren't as deep. His shoulders didn't carry the same weight. And there, at the corner of his mouth, something she'd never seen on his face, the beginning of a smile. The woman beside him had dark hair pinned up in the style of the last decade. Her eyes were kind, open, the sort of eyes that looked at the camera without fear, without pretense. She held the baby against her chest, and the baby's tiny fist curled around her finger. Hannah stared at that fist, so small, so certain of its grip. The baby would have been, 4 months, 5. Old enough to hold on, not old enough to walk, not old enough to wear the small leather shoes she'd just noticed on the dresser's edge. She picked one up. The sole was smooth, unscuffed, never touched the ground. Her throat closed tight. She thought of the wooden horse in the kitchen cupboard, the chipped ear, the dust that had clung to it, the way she'd shut the door fast, not wanting to know. Now she knew. Daniel hadn't remarried because he wanted a wife. He'd remarried because he'd been alone in this house with these ghosts for 5 years, and somewhere along the way, the silence had become too heavy to carry alone. Hannah set the shoe down, set the photograph back exactly where she'd found it. The dust would show her fingerprints, she could see them now. Dark smudges against the gray. Nothing she could do about that. She backed out of the room. Her hand found the door, pulled it closed with a soft click that sounded loud as a gunshot in the quiet house. The hallway stretched dark before her. Kitchen light flickered at the far end. She walked toward it on legs that didn't feel like her own. Her mind full of that photograph. That almost smile, that tiny fist. Dinner the next night was roast chicken again. She'd killed the bird herself that morning, plucked and cleaned it the way her mother had taught her. The skin crisped up, golden. The meat fell off the bone. Daniel ate without speaking. So did she. But Hannah couldn't look at him. Every time she tried, she saw the man in the photograph, the almost smile, the way his hand had rested on his wife's shoulder, protective. Proud. Full of something that seemed impossible for the silent man sitting across from her now. She knew his secret. That was the problem. She knew what lived in the room at the end of the hall. She knew about the shawl that still smelled of lavender, the shoes that had never been worn, the mobile that would never spin for the child it was made for, and he didn't know she knew. The lie sat between them, invisible but heavy. Hannah pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. "You feeling all right?" His voice made her jump. She looked up, couldn't help it, and found his eyes waiting. "Fine," she said. "Just tired." He studied her for a moment. Something flickered in his expression, concern. Maybe. Or suspicion. Then he nodded and returned to his meal. Hannah forced herself to eat. The chicken tasted like nothing. After dinner. She washed the dishes alone. Daniel went out to the barn. The kitchen window framed his silhouette as he crossed the yard, lantern swinging at his side. She thought about the woman in the photograph. Sarah, that was the name she'd heard whispered in town, behind gloved hands and raised eyebrows. Sarah, who had worn that green shawl. Sarah, who had sat in that rocking chair and sung to a baby who would never grow up. 5 years. Daniel had been alone with those ghosts for 5 years, and now Hannah was here, standing in Sarah's kitchen, washing Sarah's dishes, sleeping in the room down the hall from the nursery that still waited for a child who would never come home, her hands stilled in the water. What was she doing here? What was she supposed to be? A replacement, a distraction, a warm body to fill the empty space. The questions multiplied in her chest, pressing against her ribs until she couldn't breathe. She dried her hands on the apron, set it on the hook by the stove, walked to her room and closed the door. The suitcase lived under the bed. She hadn't touched it since the first night. Now she pulled it out and set it on the mattress, running her fingers along the worn leather edges. Tomorrow, she told herself. She'd decide tomorrow, but even as she thought it, she knew the decision was already made. The neighbor woman arrived mid-morning with a basket of preserves and a smile that showed too many teeth. Hannah saw her coming up the road from the kitchen window, a sturdy figure in a brown wool dress, picking her way around the puddles left by last night's snow. The woman's name was Mrs. Harlow behind her hymnal. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron and met her at the door. "I brought apple butter," Mrs. Harlow said, thrusting the basket forward. "Thought you might be running low on preserves. A new wife doesn't always know what to stock before winter." A new wife. The words landed strange. "Thank you," Hannah said. "Would you like to come in?" She shouldn't have asked. She knew at the moment Mrs. Harlow stepped over the threshold and started looking around, eyes moving across the kitchen. The parlor doorway, the hallway leading to the back of the house, taking inventory, measuring, judging. "You're settling in well, I hope." Mrs. Harlow settled into the chair by the stove without being invited. It must be hard, stepping into another woman's place. Hannah's hands found the edge of the table. Gripped. "I'm managing." "Of course you are." Mrs. Harlow's smile didn't waver. "Daniel's a good man. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Took Sarah's passing hard, as you can imagine. And the baby." She shook her head. Lips pressed into a line of practiced sympathy. "Diphtheria. Nothing anyone could do. The little one went first, and Sarah followed 3 days after. Some folks said she died of grief more than the sickness." The kitchen walls pressed inward. Hannah's throat tightened. "I didn't know the details," she managed. "Didn't you?" Mrs. Harlow's eyebrows rose. "I would have thought someone would have told you. Before the wedding. I mean, seems only fair. A girl knowing what she's walking into." She paused. Let the silence stretch. "But I suppose your father had his reasons for keeping quiet. A man with debts that size doesn't have much room for honesty, does he?" The blood rushed to Hannah's face. Hot. Stinging. "I should check on the bread," she said. Her voice came out thin. Wrong. "Of course, dear." Mrs. Harlow stood, smoothing her skirts. "I'll see myself out. You take care now. And don't mind what folks say in town. Most of them mean well. They just wonder, is all." "Wonder what?" Mrs. Harlow paused at the door. The smile was gone now, replaced by something that looked almost like pity, the kind given to stray dogs and slow children. "Whether you're a wife or a replacement, whether Daniel's looking for a partner or just someone to warm the bed his first wife died in." She tilted her head. "I'm sure it's the former. You seem like a sweet girl, even if you did come a bit discounted." The door closed behind her. Hannah stood alone in the kitchen, her hands shaking against the table, her face burning like she'd been slapped. Discounted. The word echoed in her skull. She grabbed her shawl from the hook and pushed out the back door. Needing air. Needing space. Needing to be anywhere but inside those walls. The yard stretched before her brown grass, patches of melting snow. The path to the chicken coop worn to mud by weeks of her own footsteps. She walked without seeing. Her thoughts churned discounted. Replacement. Warming a dead woman's bed, and her boots found the edge of the path where yesterday's snowmelt had pooled and frozen and thawed again into something slick and treacherous. Her foot slipped, her arms pinwheeled. Balance gone. She hit the ground hard. Cold seeped through her dress immediately. Mud splattered up her sleeves, across her apron, into her hair. The smell of wet earth and manure filled her nostrils. Her palms sank into the muck, icy water seeping between her fingers. She lay there for a moment, stunned, staring up at the gray November sky. A chicken wandered past, pecking at the ground. Utterly indifferent to her humiliation. "Get up," she told herself. She didn't move. The mud soaked through her skirt, cold against her thighs, her hips, the small of her back. She could feel it seeping into the fabric, staining everything it touched. Her mother's dress, no, her only dress now. Ruined. This is what you are. The thought came unbidden, vicious. A girl who fell in the mud, a girl bought with debt, a replacement, a discount. Her eyes stung. She pressed her face into the crook of her arm and stayed there, curled in the cold muck, and let the shame wash over her in waves. That night, she couldn't eat. Daniel looked at her across the table, her hair still damp from washing. Her dress changed to the only other thing she owned. The mud scrubbed from beneath her fingernails until the skin went raw, and asked if she was feeling all right. "Tired," she said. "I think I'll turn in early." He nodded. Didn't push, never pushed. She escaped to her room and shut the door. The brass lock clicked into place, that familiar sound. The only thing in this house that still felt like hers. The suitcase lived under the bed. She'd pushed it there the first night, back when she thought she might need to leave quickly. Now she pulled it out and set it on the mattress. Carpet bag frame. Wooden slats. Brass clasps green with age. She opened it. Her hands moved without thought. The calico dress, the same one she'd worn at the wedding. Washed twice now, still carrying the faint smell of church candles and regret. She folded it small. Set it inside. Cotton undergarments, threadbare at the seams, her mother's bone hairpin, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. The shawl she'd arrived in, the one that still smelled faintly of her father's tobacco. Everything she owned fit in less than 5 minutes. Hannah sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the open suitcase. Her whole life, packed into a space smaller than a bushel basket, on the nightstand. The iron wedding band waited. She'd taken it off to scrub the mud from her hands and hadn't put it back on. Should she leave it, take it? What did it even mean anymore? She picked it up, turned it in her fingers. The metal was cold, unforgiving. A replacement. That's what Mrs. Harlow had called her. That's what the whole town thought. And maybe they were right. Maybe she was just a warm body filling a dead woman's space. Bought at a bargain because her father couldn't pay his debts any other way. Hannah set the ring back on the nightstand. Didn't put it on. Midnight came slow. The house settled around her creaking timbers. The tick of cooling wood. The distant sound of wind against the eaves. She couldn't sleep. Couldn't lie down. The suitcase sat on the bed like an accusation. Her bladder ached. She'd been avoiding the trip to the outhouse, not wanting to open her door, not wanting to risk seeing him. But she couldn't wait any longer. Hannah unlocked the door, eased it open. The hallway was dark, but light spilled from somewhere ahead. Yellow. Warm. The soft glow of a coal oil lamp burning low. She moved toward the front of the house, feet silent on the floorboards. The parlor was empty. The kitchen was empty. But through the window, she could see the porch. The lamp sat on the railing, its flame guttering in the night breeze. And beside it, Daniel. He sat on the top step, shoulders bowed, head bent. Something glinted in his hands, silver, catching the lamplight. The photograph. The one from the nursery. He must carry it with him on nights like this. Hannah pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. Daniel's shoulders shook. Just once. A small tremor that passed through him like a wave. Then he lifted one hand to his face, and she heard it, the ragged intake of breath. The sound of a man trying not to cry and failing. He was weeping. Out there in the cold. Alone. Holding the photograph of his dead wife and child. Daniel Brooks was weeping. And Hannah stood in the darkness. The packed suitcase waiting on her bed. Watching a grief she'd never been meant to see. She should have turned back. The thought came clear and sharp, go to your room. Close the door. Pretend you never saw. But Hannah's feet stayed rooted to the floorboards. Her hand pressed flat against the cold wall. Her breath came shallow. Careful. Barely a whisper of sound. Through the window. Daniel sat hunched on the porch steps. The lamp threw his shadow long across the frost-touched boards. His spine curved forward like a man carrying something too heavy to set down. His shoulders rose, fell, rose again, uneven, broken rhythm. The photograph caught the light. Hannah could see the silver frame, the pale rectangle of the image inside. The woman's face, the baby's fist. 5 years of grief pressed flat between glass and cardboard. Daniel's lips moved. She couldn't hear the words through the window, but she saw the shape of them. A name. Then another. Sarah. Joseph. His hand came up to cover his eyes. The sound that escaped him wasn't sobbing. It was older than that. Deeper. Worn smooth against the walls of his chest until it barely made noise at all. Just a shudder. A swallow. The wet catch of breath. Hannah's throat tightened. This was private, sacred, something she had no right to witness. Go back to your room. Pack your suitcase. Leave at dawn. That was the plan. That was what a girl with any sense would do. But the plan had been made by a girl who thought she was merchandise. A girl who believed she'd been sold to a stranger who wanted to own her. A girl who told herself she was a replacement, a discount, a warm body filling a dead woman's space. That girl was wrong. Hannah pushed away from the wall. Her feet found the front door. Her hand found the latch. She grabbed her wool socks and boots from beside the door, pulled them on with shaking fingers. The cold would be brutal out there, and she'd learned enough about Montana winters to know better than to go barefoot on frozen boards. The hinges creaked as the door swung open. Cold air rushed in, sharp with the smell of snow and wood smoke and winter coming fast. Daniel's head snapped up. He turned, half rising, his free hand swiping across his face too late to hide the wet tracks on his cheeks, too late to compose the rawness in his eyes. I'm sorry. The words tumbled out of him, rough and thick. I didn't mean for you to see I wasn't. Don't. Hannah stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under her weight. The cold bit through her nightgown immediately, seeping through the thin cotton, climbing up her legs despite the wool socks. She walked to the steps, sat down beside him. The wood was freezing through the fabric. She pulled her shawl tighter and didn't move. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind pushed through the dry grass beyond the yard, making a sound like distant whispers. Somewhere far off. A coyote called. The lamp flame guttered in its glass chimney, casting shadows that jumped and swayed. Daniel stared straight ahead, the photograph still clutched in his hands. His jaw worked. His throat moved. You can go, he said finally. His voice came out flat, empty. Anytime you want, I ain't keeping you. I know. I mean it. He still wouldn't look at her. You pack up tomorrow. Head back to town. I'll give you money for the stage. You can go home, back to your folks. Won't say a word against you. And the debt. His hands tightened on the photograph. I'll write your daddy a letter. Tell him it's settled. Won't nobody come after him for it. Hannah's fingers found the edge of the step. The rough grain of the wood, the place where frost had begun to form in the splinters. She pressed her palm against it and felt the cold burn. Why? She asked. Why what? Why'd you do it? The arrangement, the marriage, all of it. She turned to face him, really face him, for the first time since she'd stepped outside. You didn't need a wife? You've been managing fine on your own for 5 years. Daniel's breath left him in a long, slow exhale. The photograph lowered to his knee. He stared at the woman's face, the baby's fist, the younger version of himself who still knew how to smile. I wasn't looking for a wife, he said. Not the way you think. He paused, swallowed. I just figured, 2 folks alone. Might be less alone if they was together. His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat, tried again. I figured wrong. That ain't no excuse for what I put you through. What you put me through, making you feel like property. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. Making you think you was bought and sold like livestock. That ain't what I meant. That ain't... He stopped. His hand pressed flat against the photograph. Sarah would have skinned me alive for this, for making some girl feel like she wasn't worth more than a debt paid off. The name hung in the air between them. Sarah, the woman in the photograph, the ghost in every room of this house. Tell me about her, Hannah said. Daniel's head turned. His eyes found hers red-rimmed. Raw, stripped of every wall he'd built. What? Tell me about her. About Sarah. About... She hesitated. About Joseph. The name of the child landed like a stone dropped in still water. Daniel flinched. His grip on the photograph tightened until his knuckles went white. You went in the room, he said. Not an accusation, just a fact. I did. Found the photograph. Yes, he nodded, looked back at the image in his hands. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. Waiting. Open. Met her at a church social, he said finally. Back in Missouri, before I came out here. She was 17, I was 20. Her daddy didn't like me much, thought I was too rough, too poor, too much trouble. A ghost of something crossed his face, almost a smile. He was probably right. But she married you anyway. She married me anyway, followed me all the way out to Montana, built this house with me, had Joseph 2 winters later. His voice dropped. They were everything, my whole world, and when they got sick... He stopped. His jaw clenched. The baby went first. 3 weeks old when the fever took him. Sarah held on longer, kept telling me she'd be fine. Kept making me promise I wouldn't fall apart when she was gone. His hand pressed flat against the photograph. I held her hand when she passed, felt the warmth go out of her fingers, and I thought I honest to God thought that I'd die too, that my heart would just stop beating. The wind picked up, rattling the porch railing, sending dead leaves skittering across the yard. But it didn't stop, Daniel said. Kept beating, day after day, year after year. And I just kept going. Because what else was there to do? Hannah's eyes stung. She blinked hard, pressing her palms against the cold wood. I ain't looking for a replacement, he said. I know that's what folks say. What you thought. But Sarah... He shook his head. There ain't no replacing her. There ain't no filling that hole. I just thought maybe if I wasn't so alone all the time, the days wouldn't feel so long. He turned to face her fully. His eyes were red-rimmed, raw, stripped bare. I'm sorry, he said, for putting you in this position, for letting your daddy's debt push you into something you never wanted. You deserved better than this, better than me. Hannah's breath caught. Nobody had ever said that to her. Not her father, drowning in shame and whiskey. Not her mother, too tired to fight anymore. Not the preacher or the neighbors or the whispering women in town. You deserved better. 3 words. Simple as that. You ain't what I thought, she said. He looked at her. Waited. I thought you bought me, like a plow horse, like something to use up and set aside when you was done. Daniel flinched. The word landed hard. That what they told you in town, that's what I told myself. The lamp flickered, the wind died for a moment, and the silence pressed down on them both. Sarah would have liked you, Daniel said quietly. She had a way of seeing through all the nonsense, cutting right to what mattered. His thumb traced the edge of the frame. First time I got too proud. She'd cut me back down to size. I used to hate it. He paused. Now I'd give anything to hear her do it one more time. Hannah looked at him. Really looked. The lines carved deep around his eyes. The gray threading through his hair at the temples. The way his hands held that photograph like it might crumble to dust. This wasn't a man who wanted to own anything. This was a man who'd lost everything that mattered and was just trying to survive the days that came after. The suitcase was still on her bed. Her things were still packed. She could still leave at dawn. But sitting there on that frozen porch, her feet cold despite the wool socks, her nightgown thin as paper against the November wind, Hannah felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since she'd walked into that church with trembling hands. She wasn't sure she wanted to go. Hannah stood in her room and looked at the suitcase. The calico dress lay folded inside, same as before. The cotton undergarments. The bone hairpin wrapped in its scrap of cloth. Everything she owned, packed tight and waiting. On the nightstand. The iron wedding band sat where she'd left it. Her feet were still cold despite the wool socks. Her nightgown still carried the chill from the porch. But something else had settled into her chest. Something she couldn't name. Didn't want to examine too closely. Not yet. She crossed to the bed, reached into the suitcase. Her fingers found the dress rough cotton, worn soft at the seams, and lifted it out. One piece at a time. She opened the drawer, set the dress inside, smoothed it flat against the wood. The undergarments came next, then the hairpin, still wrapped in its cloth, then the shawl that smelled of her father's tobacco and the home she'd thought she wanted to return to. The suitcase sat empty on the bed. Hannah closed it, slid it back under the frame where it had lived for weeks. Her eyes found the nightstand. The ring. She picked it up. The iron was cold against her palm. The weight familiar now in a way it hadn't been before. She turned it once, twice, then slid it back onto her finger. It fit different than she remembered. Or maybe she was different. The door waited. Still locked from the inside, that brass mechanism she'd relied on every night since she'd arrived. Her fortress. Her control. Her way of keeping the world at arm's length. Hannah crossed to it. Her hand found the lock. The metal was cool under her fingers. She could feel the shape of the bolt, the way it sat snug in its housing. the barrier it created between her and everything outside. She'd spent weeks behind this door, weeks waiting for something terrible, weeks bracing for demands that never came. The bolt turned. The lock clicked open. The sound was different now. Not a surrender, not a defeat, a choice. Hannah pulled the door wide. Lamplight from the parlor spilled into the hallway, casting a long yellow rectangle across the floor. She stepped through it. She didn't close the door behind her. The house was quiet. The fire in the parlor stove had burned down to embers, giving off the smell of ash and cedar. Through the front window, she could see the porch lamp still burning, its flame low now. The wick nearly spent. Daniel hadn't moved. She found her shawl on the hook by the door, her own, the one she'd brought from home, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The wool was rough against her neck. Familiar, hers. The front door opened without a sound. The cold hit her immediately, sharper now than before, carrying the first smell of snow on the wind. Her breath fogged in front of her face. Daniel sat where she'd left him, shoulders bowed, the photograph resting on his knee. He looked up when the hinges creaked. "Thought you went to bed," he said. "I did." She crossed the porch. The boards groaned under her feet, frost crackling beneath her boots. She sat down beside him, not across, not at a distance. Beside, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm through her shawl. The lamp flickered between them, throwing shadows across the steps. "I ain't staying because of what my daddy owes." Daniel turned his head. His eyes found hers, red-rimmed still, raw, but steadier now. "And I ain't staying because I got nowhere else to go." She pulled the shawl tighter. "I'm staying because I seen who you are, and I reckon—" She stopped, swallowed, found the words again. "I reckon two folks alone together ain't as bad as being alone by yourself." He didn't speak. His jaw worked, his throat moved. Hannah reached over. Her hand found his, the one not holding the photograph, and settled on top of it. His skin was cold, rough with calluses, real. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his hand turned beneath hers. His fingers laced through hers, held on. Behind them, the door to the house stood open. The lamplight spilled out across the porch, pooling at their feet. The wind carried the first flakes of snow small, scattered, catching the light like tiny stars falling slow. Neither of them moved to go inside. Neither of them spoke. The lamp wick burned down to its last quarter-inch, the flame guttering low. 2 cold coffee cups sat forgotten on the porch rail. And in the silence, sitting side by side on that frozen porch, they watched the snow begin to fall across the Montana sky. Some stories leave us quiet. This one, I think, is that kind. There is something tender about watching two people find their way toward each other, not through grand gestures or perfect words, but through small choices made in the dark. A plate of bread left outside a locked door, a hand reaching across a frozen porch. The decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. Many of us know what it feels like to carry something heavy alone, to wonder if anyone sees us clearly, to sit with grief so long it becomes part of the furniture, part of how we move through our own homes. And perhaps some of us also know the strange, fragile thing that happens when someone chooses to sit beside us anyway, not to fix anything, just to be there. It is all right if this story stirred something that does not have a name. It is all right if it lingers a little longer than expected. Some things are not meant to be resolved. They are only meant to be held. Gently, the way we hold old photographs or letters we cannot bring ourselves to throw away. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.